Hey everyone. Today we're going to be talking about westward expansion. Now, the United States has been expanding for quite some time. People moving west of the Appalachian Mountains and encroaching further on Native American land. Last week we talked about the Trail of Tears and the Potawatomi Trail of Death, some other instances of settlement towards the west. But when we're talking about this westward expansion here, we are talking about the lands west of the Mississippi River. So that is what we're going to be looking at today. And a really famous, iconic scene is something like what we have in our picture here with wagon trains on a trail going west. And we're going to talk about a couple of those as well. All right. So we're going to be looking at a couple of different regions. We're going to start here in the Pacific Northwest with the Oregon Country. Now, the Oregon Country is defined by this region west of the Rocky Mountains, which includes Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and parts of Western Canada. Now, this land was very appealing to people. It was very fertile land that was good for growing things. They had very mild temperatures and plenty of rainfall. If you've ever visited Seattle or Portland or any of those cities, they can be pretty rainy at certain times of year. We also have beautiful landscape, coastal mountains, and really dense forests, which make animal life very abundant. And this is going to attract a lot of fur trappers out to Oregon Country. Now, the land claimed out here was claimed by the British, the United States, as well as Native Americans, of course. And so the land that we're looking at here is this region right here. The southern part is the U.S. territory, and the northern area is the British territory. So we have this joint occupation of this land. And of course, there are Native Americans all throughout this region, and in fact, all throughout the West as well. And then I want to draw your attention to this line of latitude right here, the 5440 North latitude line. This is the top of the British territory, and that's going to come into play for us a little bit later. All right. Okay. Now, most of the whites out here in Oregon Country are going to be fur traders, selling beaver and other furs to China, crossing the Pacific and going over into Asia. And we're even going to have people coming from the east coast of the United States, namely Boston, stopping over in the Oregon Territory to get furs to then cross over to the Pacific and trade with China and other Asian countries. So the Pacific Northwest here is going to be a major hub of that fur trade. Now, the people doing this fur trading are going to be called mountain men, just a name for the adventurous men who hiked through the forests of Oregon Country, trapping animals and living off the land. You can see the picture right here. This guy, he has like animal skins and furs on. He's trapped a deer here. He's hunted it. And so these men are going to have really special survival skills that are going to enable them to live out in this rugged terrain. And they're going to get a reputation for being what are called rugged individualists, people who follow their own independent course in life, people who are not tied to the rest of society out east. And they're going to make most of their profits selling furs. And so they're going to do this with the help of Native Americans as well, who are going to teach them the survival skills. They'll intermarry with Native American women, and they'll spend a lot of their winters with Native Americans for shelter and food through the bitter winters. Now, at certain points of the year, the fur traders or the mountain men would have a rendezvous, which is a French word meaning a get together. And they would meet with other fur traders out west for entertainment and bargaining, trading their goods and selling things to make their money. Now, eventually, around the 1830s, fur trapping kind of dies off. Due to over trapping, killing too many animals too quickly without leaving any time for them to replenish their population. So that part of the mountain men's life is going to kind of die off a little bit, but they will adapt. They'll start exploring the West and leading settlers across the mountain trails into the Oregon Territory. They'll establish forts and trails that other people will then follow out west. And one really famous mountain man who led settlers was James Beckwourth, who was an escaped slave. We have a picture of him right here. We also have missionaries moving into the Oregon country to establish schools and clinics. Two really famous missionaries were Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, and they connected themselves pretty closely to the Cayuse people, a Native American group in the Oregon Territory. And they encouraged white settlers to come to Oregon with enticing reports about how plentiful the land was and what a good life you could have in Oregon country. And so, with all these new white settlers coming out to Oregon, they brought with them a lot of conflict and then, of course, disease as well, which impacted the Cayuse people. In 1847, there was a measles outbreak that killed a lot of the Cayuse. And so the angry Native Americans ended up attacking the whites, killed the Whitmans, and 12 other people kind of in revenge for the death that had been brought by these white settlers. So we're going to continue to see conflicts with the Native American groups and other groups like the Spanish-speaking people who are in some of these territories out west as well. The more Americans that come in, the more conflict we're going to see. Okay. Now, beginning in 1843, pioneers started using what is called the Oregon Trail, traveling west in wagon trains, like I pointed out to you in our picture at the beginning, to make this journey. So you can see on this map here, the journey would begin in early spring. They would set out from Independence, Missouri here, gather up their people, gather up supplies. They would elect leaders who would help make decisions along the trail, and then they would begin their journey west in May. So they would set out, cross this terrain. We've got the Rocky Mountains out here that they're going to have to cross. Some of it is very dry prairie land. Some of it is these dense forests that we'll get here in Oregon. So it's going to be a very treacherous journey as well until they reach Oregon City here in the Oregon country. Now, this is a 2,000-mile route that they're going to follow. So the pioneers have about 5 months to make this journey if they're going to beat the mountain snow around here. And so they need to make good time. So they're going to have to travel about 15 miles a day in order to get to Oregon by October before they have to deal with really heavy snows in this area. Okay. And so life on the trail was pretty routine. You would wake up at dawn to the sound of a bugle blowing. Girls would help prepare the food. Boys would harness horses and oxen. And then at 6 a.m., everyone would yell wagons ho, and they would set out on the trail for the day. There would be a noonday meal break for lunch, and then by 6 or 7 at night, they would stop, circle the wagons, as you can see here, and you see it in a lot of Western movies and things like that. They would do this to keep cattle inside and for safety as well. And then they would spend the night and then start it all over again the next morning. Now, there's a lot of hardships along this trail. Like I said before, there's really rough terrain. You've got to cross rivers, you've got to cross mountains, and it's not like when we travel today where there's paved roads, clear paths to go. These people are forging these paths as they go forward. So there's no fast food to stop at. You've got a ton of gear with you. You're bringing everything with you, and so oftentimes they had to leave things behind, especially if you've got to go up over a mountain or you have to ford a river or something like that. You're going to lose things along the way. They also faced extreme weather, blistering heat in some areas, biting cold in other areas, snow and rain and other elements of just being outdoors constantly over the course of this journey. And then there would be sickness as well. Cholera was a major killer on the Oregon Trail, and other diseases spread quickly because you have this tight-knit group all traveling together. And as we have seen in the last few weeks here, we can see how quickly disease can spread. They also engaged in trade with Native Americans. Some Native Americans would be very helpful to them along the trail. Other Native Americans would meet them with conflict. But between 1840 and 1860, we get about 50,000 Americans reaching Oregon, which is going to be a pretty big rise in the American population out west. All right, so we're going to start to see statehood for some of these regions. We'll eventually see the Oregon country break up into the actual state of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, those states out there. Now, traveling south to Texas. Texas is going to be a major disputed territory that we'll see in the mid 19th century here. Now, originally, Texas was controlled by the Spanish. The Spanish had control of a lot of the land out west, including the Texas Territory, the New Mexico Territory, California, and then, of course, Mexico itself. Now, under Spanish rule, the Spanish did not want Americans colonizing Texas. They wanted to keep it as part of Mexico. But in 1821, this guy named Moses Austin comes along, and the Spanish grant him a piece of land to set up as a colony. But unfortunately for Moses Austin, Mexico wins its independence from Spain in 1821. And so there's this question about whether or not this land grant is going to be honored by the new Mexican government in that territory. And so Austin's son, Stephen, ends up going down to the Mexican government in Mexico City and addressing this issue of the land grant. And Mexico actually has a different view of Texas than the Spanish did. Mexico actually wanted people to settle the land. One reason was to help control Indian attacks on people in the region. And so by the time Austin starts setting up this colony, there's about 4,000 Mexicans living in Texas. And so Stephen Austin sets up his colony, gathers about 300 families to move into Texas, and the charter goes forward. So that by about 1830, we've got over 20,000 Americans living in Texas. Now, you might recognize this name, Austin. That's going to be the inspiration for the city of Austin, Texas, which we have today. So that's just a little caveat there. All right, so we've got 50,000 people in Oregon, 20,000 Americans in Texas now. Okay. Now, it's not going to be all rosy and rainbows in Texas. The Americans living in Texas were required by Mexico to be loyal Mexican citizens and to worship in the Roman Catholic Church. But the Americans really don't feel a lot of loyalty to Mexico. They didn't try to learn Spanish. They didn't try to adapt to their ways. And so eventually in 1830, Mexico bans Americans from settling in Texas. And they're afraid that the American Texans, are going to want to become a part of the United States rather than remain part of Mexico. And so the enforced laws that had been ignored by the Americans in Texas inspired Mexican troops to be sent into the territory to enforce the law. And one person who gains power in Mexico in 1833 is Santa Anna, who grows to be a dictator. He throws out the Mexican Constitution and uses his power and authority to control the Texas territory. So you can imagine how Americans in Texas are going to respond to someone like Santa Anna coming in and enforcing these laws. All right. So eventually the Americans in Texas want independence from Mexico. So we've got two major groups in Mexico at this time that we're going to be talking about here. Obviously, there's Native Americans. But our two major groups that are going to be contributing to this independence movement are going to be the Tejanos, who are Texans of Mexican descent, who want to end Santa Anna's reign. So they don't necessarily want to become part of the United States, but they don't want Santa Anna ruling over them either. And then we have the American Texans who do want to become part of the United States. And before they can get there, they need to become independent from Mexico. So we start to see in October of 1835 a clash between the Texans and the Mexican troops in the city of Gonzales. And the Texans are able to force the Mexicans to withdraw their troops until December 1835, when Santa Anna brings a large army north to end a rebellion that has begun between the Texans and the Mexicans. Texans occupied the city of San Antonio, and so Santa Anna is trying to bring them to heal, to end this rebellion. And so a group of Texans, a few months later, declares independence for the Republic of Texas in March of 1836, and they place a man named Sam Houston in charge of the Texan army. And so they're going to try to defend their independence against Santa Anna and the Mexican army, which is going to have its ups and downs for them. All right. So Santa Anna reaches San Antonio, and the Texans decide to take up a position in the old Spanish mission called the Alamo, which is in this picture right here. There's about 150 Texans holed up in there, and they are going to face this giant Mexican army of about 6,000 troops. And some famous Texans who were, famous Americans who were in and fighting among the Texans was Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett, who you might recognize from the song. So they engage in this siege that's happening. The enemy forces, in this case Mexico, surrounds the city or the fort, in this case the Alamo, and bombards it with cannons. So Mexico is trying to break in. The Texans are trying to defend the Alamo mission. So the Texan commander ends up sending a letter out with a messenger asking for help from other Texans and Americans. And so eventually, Santa Anna launches this giant attack on the Alamo after about 13 days. The Mexicans shout "Viva Santa Anna," and they attack the Alamo. About 180 Texans are killed, and about 1,500 Mexicans are killed in this battle. Now, this is technically a loss for the Texans, even though more Mexicans were killed here. But as you can see, we started with 150 Texans. We get a little bit of help from the outside, and so 180 Texans end up being killed. So that's a pretty big dent in the Texan force. So Mexico wins here. The surviving Texans are executed, except for 15 people who are allowed to live to tell the story of the Alamo as a warning to future Texans about what would happen if they tried to rebel against Mexico. So this event is this particular one with the Alamo is called the Battle of the Alamo, but this independence movement is usually called the Texas Revolution and the Texas Rebellion for this event. All right. Now, we have a couple of other battles that take place after the Alamo. The Battle of Goliad. This is a clash between Mexican troops and the Texans again. The Texans end up surrendering, but what's a little bit different here is that the Texans are massacred. Now, generally, when you surrender, you're given leniency and you're taken as a prisoner, but in this case, they were massacred. And so this inspires a lot of Texans to join the cause for independence, shouting things like, "Remember the Goliad, remember the Alamo." So a lot of Texans are going to be eager to fight. So that brings us to the Battle of San Jacinto, which takes place along the San Jacinto River. Santa Anna and his soldiers are camped by the river, and they are surprised by an attack by the Texans. The Texans end up capturing Santa Anna the next day and force him to sign a treaty granting Texas their independence. Now, this is going to be good for Texas, but Mexico in general is eventually going to not honor or acknowledge this treaty granting Texas their independence. But that doesn't matter for right now. The Republic of Texas is established. They create their own constitution, which is modeled after the U.S. Constitution, and they elect Sam Houston, who was leading the Texan military, as president of the Republic of Texas in 1836. And so they called themselves the Lone Star Republic after the flag that they had for Texas. And this is Sam Houston here. Again, he will lend his name to another famous city in Texas, Houston, Texas. So we've got Austin and Houston showing up here. Now, some of the problems that the Lone Star Republic is going to face are, one, this lack of acknowledgement from Mexico. It's hard to be an independent country if nobody recognizes you as an independent country. Texas was also bankrupt from all the fighting that had gone on, and they're also dealing with Native American tribes raiding their settlements because, again, whites are encroaching on this long held Native American land in the process of all of this movement. So, a lot of Texans see the solution to these problems as joining the US. And so, they're going to want to become a US state, but that's going to come with its own problems as well. All right. So this is called annexation, process of adding territory to a large domain. So in this case, the United States. So anytime you see annex Texas or annexation, it's talking about adding territory to the country. And so Americans are mostly going to be divided over slavery. As new territories are gaining the population that is required for statehood, the question is going to be okay, if you join the United States, are you going to be a slave state or are you going to be a free state? And of course, the people in the North support a free state, whereas the Southern states are going to support new states coming in as slave states. Jackson is also worried about starting a war with Mexico. If Mexico doesn't recognize that Texas is independent, they see Texas as their territory. And so for the United States to then bite off a chunk of their country, they're not going to respond very well to that. So Congress refuses to add Texas to the United States. Eventually they will, but for now, they say, no, we're not going to annex Texas. So Texas starts attracting new settlers to their land. They promise free land for people coming out west, and thousands more Americans are going to move to Texas because of the Panic of 1837, which we mentioned last week was a depression, a financial crisis in the United States that's going to cause joblessness and other issues that are going to force people out of the East and seek new opportunities in the West. So by the 1840s, we have about 140,000 people living in Texas. All right. So a lot of white Americans coming west. 140,000 here in Texas. We've got 50,000 in Oregon, another 20,000 uh, previously before we even got here to Texas. So a lot of people moving out here. Okay. We also have this New Mexico territory, which includes Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado. Now, this land was originally ruled by the Spanish between 1598 and 1821. And under the Spanish, they did not want any Americans settling anywhere in the New Mexico territory, so similar to what we saw in Texas. But once Mexico gains their independence in 1821 and they take over the New Mexico territory, they welcome Americans to come settle. And one of these settlers is going to be William Becknell. He's the first American to head for the city of Santa Fe, and he is going to start in Franklin, Missouri. You can see Independence here, where our Oregon Trail travelers started out. So he's going to start in Franklin, and he's going to travel this path, which will eventually be called the Santa Fe Trail, and ends here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So we've got the Oregon Trail heading up this way, Santa Fe Trail heading down southwest this way. Right. And then we have California coming into play as well. So just like the other southern territories, we've got Spanish explorers who reach California in 1542, and they rule this land until Mexico gains their independence in 1821, like the other territories. Now, while the Spanish were there, they set up missions, about 21 missions all throughout California. And these missions were pretty self-sufficient. They could produce enough for their own needs. They didn't really need a lot of help with that. And their major goal was to convert Native Americans to the Roman Catholic faith. And so they would exploit these Native Americans, use them to work, to grow food for them, and so on. And they ended up overworking a lot of the Native Americans. And we'll see this all throughout Spanish history in the Americas. They do not get on very well with the Native Americans. Eventually, the missions converted to large cattle farms to speed up development in California, which attracts a lot of people to come in. And then Spanish soldiers start building forts near the missions as well. So they kind of have this religious and military foothold in California. By the mid 1840s, there's about 700 Americans living in California, so not a huge number. But the US wants to buy California to get control of the ports that would give them access to the Pacific Ocean. So remember, we've got some trade going on with Asia that we'd like to expand. And so California is going to experience some changes here that we'll deal with in a little bit. All right. Now, a major drive for Americans moving west was this idea of manifest destiny. Manifest means clear or obvious. Destiny means something that is sure to happen. So, with this idea of manifest destiny, it's the idea that the United States is destined by God or providence or whatever divine force they believed in to expand their territory and spread democracy across North America. A lot of Americans believed that their nation and government was the best in the world, that they were superior to any of the other cultures or governments that we see in the West, namely Native Americans and Mexicans. And so they're going to use this as a justification to think of themselves as superior to these groups and to take over those lands. So this phrase, manifest destiny, was coined by a New York newspaper. The editor was John O'Sullivan in 1845. And so people start latching on to this idea of manifest destiny. You can kind of see in this picture here, this is an angel moving west here. And we have all these different settlers. You see a covered wagon here, some different carts, people moving. So this is supposed to represent American progress and expanding west into those territories that were held by the inferior Native American and Mexicans that Americans saw them as. And so they're going to take over those lands and use manifest destiny to justify that takeover. Right. Now, we have a change of power here in 1844. With the election of 1844, we had two major candidates, Henry Clay versus James K. Polk. Now, Clay opposed annexation of Texas. We saw earlier when we were talking about sectionalism that he was not really in favor of slavery, even though he owned slaves himself. Polk, on the other hand, really wants to expand U.S. territory, and he is in favor of annexing Texas as well as Oregon to the United States. And so he makes this demand during the campaign that we are going to have the Oregon Territory all the way up to that 5440 north latitude line that I showed you guys earlier, north of the northern border of the British territory. And so he starts this campaign slogan called 5440 or fight. And so people really rally around this idea of adding territory in, and James Polk wins the election, which demonstrates American support for expansionism. They want to move west, so they elect someone who is going to help them get there. Now, Polk was not really a warmonger. He's not really trying to fight the British. He doesn't want to bring the United States into a war with the British. So he strikes a compromise with the British for the Oregon country. And so he says that Britain is going to have the land north of the 49 north latitude line, whereas the U.S. would get the land to the south. And that's about where the Canadian border is today. So we're not really 5440 or fight. We're 49 latitude and let's get along. Okay. Now, this issue of annexing Texas comes up again. Now, again, Polk is in favor of joining with Texas in the United States, but Congress is still afraid of a war with Mexico if we add that territory to our land. So Sam Houston, as president of Texas, threatens to align himself with the British. Now, again, we don't want a war with Britain. And so this threat works against the United States, and so the U.S. gives in and allows Texas to join the United States. So it looks like we are more willing to go to war with Mexico than we are willing to go to war with Britain, because of course this is going to upset Mexico. We're taking a bite out of their land that they view as theirs. And so a lot of Mexicans are going to get very angry about this. They had never accepted Texan independence. They had refused Polk's offer to buy California and New Mexico previously. And they feared that American rebellions and expansion would bleed into their territories in California and New Mexico. So they do not want the United States taking over Texas. Americans, on the other hand, feel that Mexico is standing in the way of our manifest destiny, our God given right to take over this land. And so this is going to erupt into what is called the Mexican American War, which is a 20-month long conflict between 1846 and 1848 when it officially ends. Right. So the war begins with kind of this little power move from President Polk. He orders a man named Zachary Taylor, who will later become president, to set up posts in the disputed land between the Rio Grande and the U.S. border. And I'll show you on the map in a second where that is. The Mexican troops then are sent to that disputed area to meet the U.S. who are there already, and so Polk uses this invasion of the Mexicans to convince Congress to declare war on Mexico. Now it's not quite an invasion. Zachary Taylor and his troops were sent into that land, and Mexico goes in to meet them there, and so this is kind of coerced, if I can say that. Now, Americans in general were divided about this war with Mexico. The North is opposed to the war because they view Texas annexation as a way to add slave states to the Union, and they don't want that. And one Northerner in particular, Henry David Thoreau, who's a really famous writer, wrote a lot of poetry, and he wrote a really famous story called On Walden Pond. He is jailed for refusing to pay taxes to support the war. So this is a really famous instance of civil disobedience in protest of the Mexican-American War. The South and the West, on the other hand, are generally in favor of the war. The South wants slave states added to the Union, and the West is in favor of Texas because they want to join the United States. There are Americans there. They should be part of America. So this is the area that we're talking about here. Now, the Texas Republic, the independent Lone Star Republic, is not what we normally think of as Texas. It's kind of this eastern part here. We can see San Antonio where Battle of the Alamo was. All right. Now, the disputed territory is between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River. And so this area here is all that disputed territory. So this is where Zachary Taylor marches into, and the Mexicans meet up there and they have a battle. And so this is where the inspiration for the actual declaration of war on Mexico comes from, this disputed territory here. All right. Now, the war is going to be fought on many fronts. We're going to have battles going on in California, in Mexico itself, in the disputed Texan territory. General Taylor is going to defeat Santa Anna at the Battle of Buena Vista. And General Winfield Scott is going to land at Veracruz and march to Mexico City, which is going to place a lot of pressure on the Mexican government as well. And then we see rebellion happening in Northern California. They decide in Northern California that they don't want to be ruled by Mexico anymore, so they declare their independence in June of 1846 and nickname themselves the Bear Flag Republic after their flag, which has the bear on it. And even today's state of California has a bear on their state flag. And so they declare their independence from Mexico and join the U.S. in the fight against Mexico. So we have these fights breaking out all over the Southwest, which is going to eventually become part of the United States. Now, the American Army captures Santa Fe, New Mexico, without a single shot fired. They also capture San Diego and win control of Southern California. And then the U.S. also controls New Mexico at this point and Northern California in 1847. And then we have General Scott in Mexico. So the U.S. has a pretty tight hold on all of these different territories controlled by Mexico. So Mexico is not really in a good position here during the Mexican-American War as the fighting goes on. All right. And so the war ends in favor of the United States with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Mexico agrees to give up their land in California and New Mexico, which is going to come to be called the Mexican Cession. And the U.S. agrees to pay Mexico $15 million and agrees to respect the rights of the Spanish-speaking people in those territories. Now, the people who are already living there are not going to just get up and leave and go to Mexico. They are going to stay in their lands. And so we're going to see some clashes of culture here out in the West as well. And a lot of people who live in the Southwest today of Mexican descent say that we didn't cross the border crossed us. And this is what they're referring to there with the Mexican cession. In 1853, the United States also purchases the Gadsden Territory, which is Arizona and parts of New Mexico, a small strip along the U.S.-Mexican border. And they need that land to finish a railroad that they have heading out west. And so the U.S. pays Mexico $10 million for that land. And Americans see this as the fulfillment of manifest destiny. We've got control of Oregon, we've got Texas, we've got this Mexican cession, we've got California, and now we're going to take this last little strip here and add it to the Union. So that is the fulfillment here of manifest destiny as far as North America goes. And then, like I said, we're going to see the mixing of cultures. We've got English-speaking Americans who are coming west and settling there in these territories, and they're bringing their own culture and democracy with them to the Southwest. Um, in some cases, they're going to be aided by the Mexican Americans and Native Americans who are living there, blend with their cultures. A lot of our English words blend with Spanish words to become something new. New laws will be established there. But a lot of the white settlers are going to be mistreating these Mexican Americans and Native Americans that we'll continue to see throughout the 1800s by taking their land and enforcing what they believe to be their own superiority over these inferior groups. All right, so this is the territory that we're talking about. You can see Texas is starting to take shape here. We get control of all of this land. This is the disputed area from before that we get control of after the war. This is the Mexican cession land, which includes California and the rest of the New Mexico territory. And then this strip right here is the Gadsden purchase in 1853. So we're really starting to see the southern border of the United States take its modern shape. Right. Now, a couple of other instances of people moving west. We said earlier that a lot of the Spanish missionaries had taken control of certain lands. We see missionaries in Oregon country as well. And so we're going to have this group of Mormons come out to Utah. Now, Mormons are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was founded by Joseph Smith out in New York in 1830. And they had some beliefs that kind of diverted from a lot of other Christian beliefs. One of those was the belief that property should be owned in common rather than by individuals, which a lot of Americans in the East did not agree with. And then they also allowed men to have more than one wife, which you can imagine some of our descendants from Puritans in New England and so on would not take kindly to such beliefs and practices. So a lot of non-Mormons were very angry about the beliefs of the Mormons and persecuted them for their faith, which is going to push a lot of the Mormons west. So Joseph Smith picks up and leads a bunch of Mormons west. They go through Ohio and Illinois. Joseph Smith ends up getting killed by an angry mob in Illinois in 1844, which leads Brigham Young to become the Mormon leader. And that's him in this picture here. He establishes a refuge, which is a place of safety from persecution, at the Great Salt Lake in Utah. He puts together designs for Salt Lake City, which we'll eventually have, and he becomes the governor of the Utah Territory in 1850. And of course, in this process, we're taking Native American lands away in order to do this, but the Mormons are finding their safe refuge here in Utah. And then eventually in 1896, Utah becomes its own state. But the Mormons are going to be out there, and then other groups will come to Utah as well. Right? Now, we mentioned California before. We only had about 700 Americans living in California, but that number is going to explode after 1848 when John Sutter discovers gold on his land in Northern California. Word spreads to San Francisco, and people start to get what is called gold fever. people from all over the United States and all over the world end up coming to California trying to get rich on this gold that's there. So people are coming from not just the eastern part of the United States, but Europe, China, Australia, and South America, people rushing in to California to find their fortunes. This is called the California Gold Rush. Now, uh, in 1849, this is the big year that people start heading out to California. And these people are going to be called the 49ers after the year that they moved out. So a little over 80,000 people are going to travel to California in this year and start mining for gold. They mine it in gold fields where you can just kind of pick up gold off the ground. Eventually, they'll have to pan for gold, which is digging up silt in rivers and siphoning off the gravel to have the gold float down to the bottom. And then underground mines eventually will be built as well to continue mining for gold. Now, very few people are going to get really rich off of this gold in California. But the main thing here is that thousands of people establish their homes in California, even though they don't get rich from mining gold. But there'll be other opportunities for wealth, land, and so on in California that's going to bring a lot of people out. And so California joins the US as a state in 1850. They have the numbers for it, of course, from the California Gold Rush, and they are joined. Okay. Now, with the gold rush, we've got a very diverse population coming in to the West. We've got runaway slaves from the southern states, people from Hawaii, China, Peru, Chile, France, Germany, Italy, Ireland, and Australia, plus white Americans coming from the East. And so all these different groups are going to have to live together and function together. And so we're going to get blending of some cultures, the destruction of others, and lots of different groups having a foothold in these lands. All right, so we've got Mexican Americans living out west. Their first constitution was written in Spanish and English in California, which is just a mark of how many Spanish speaking people were there. And a lot of these people ended up losing land to newcomers from Europe and the United States. Native Americans, of course, are going to be very negatively impacted. Large numbers of Native Americans are going to die due to starvation, disease, murder, plus they'll lose a lot of their lands. And you can see with these numbers here, in 1850, there were about 100,000 Native Americans living in California. By the 1870s, just 20 years later, there's only 17,000 Native Americans in California. So that's a big drop in the Native population there. Chinese Americans are also going to face discrimination and prejudice. A lot of Chinese Americans come to the West to help build the railroads, in addition to trying to find wealth with gold rush and so on. And so they help to grow and develop California, but again, face a lot of discrimination that they'll face for about 70 years throughout American history, all the way into the 1820s, the 1920s and 30s, with some of the immigration acts that are passed then. And then, of course, African Americans. A lot of African Americans end up prospering in the West in California, but a lot of them still continue to face discrimination and struggle for equality and rights, just as they had in the East. So a lot of changes here in the West. The United States is expanding its territories, expanding its population, and we see some of the growing pains that come with that, with new cultures, people dying, people facing hardship and discrimination, and so on. And so the West is going to be kind of this interesting conglomeration of all kinds of different languages and cultures, governments that will continue to see take shape here as we go on. All right, and that's all we have for today.